September 19, 1935, 8:15 p.m. West 142nd Street, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson walked up to the Cotton Club dressed like the successful businessman he was. Navy blue suit that cost 3 months' earnings, crisp French cuffs, shoes polished to mirror perfection. He looked as good as any white patron who frequented America's most famous nightclub. But when doorman Thomas Murphy saw him approaching, everything changed. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" Murphy's voice carried across the sidewalk. "This club is for white patrons only. We don't serve coloreds here, except as entertainers and staff. You need to get back to Harlem where you belong." The irony was crushing. Bumpy Johnson was already in Harlem. The Cotton Club, despite its whites-only policy, sat right in the heart of the black neighborhood, profiting from black culture while excluding black patrons. What happened next would shock New York, not because Bumpy exploded in violence, but because he didn't. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He smiled, walked away, and started planning. 26 days later, the Cotton Club would surrender completely. Segregation's most powerful symbol would be broken forever. And Bumpy Johnson would accidentally invent the blueprint for the modern civil rights movement. This is the story of the insult that changed American history. The crown jewel of segregation, the Cotton Club wasn't just any nightclub. It was the ultimate symbol of American racial segregation disguised as entertainment. Located in the heart of Harlem on West 142nd Street, the Cotton Club had built its fortune on a cruel paradox. It featured exclusively black performers, employed only black staff, and depended entirely on Harlem's cultural energy. While maintaining an absolute ban on black customers, Duke Ellington had made his reputation there. Cab Calloway performed there. The greatest black musicians in America entertained white audiences who came uptown to experience exotic Harlem nightlife while making sure no actual Harlem residents could share their tables. The club's owner, Owney Madden, was a white gangster who'd built his fortune on bootlegging. He'd purchased the Cotton Club in 1923 and turned it into New York's most profitable entertainment venue through a simple formula to exploit black talent, exclude black patrons, and extract maximum profit from the contradiction. For 12 years, this system had worked perfectly. Black musicians needed the employment too badly to protest. Black patrons had no legal recourse against discrimination, and white customers enjoyed the thrill of visiting Harlem while remaining safely segregated from its actual residents. What no one anticipated was that on September 19, 1935, this system would collide with someone who had both the resources and the ruthless intelligence to destroy it completely. The meeting that started everything. Bumpy had come to the Cotton Club that evening for a business meeting with Jacob Weinstein, a Jewish businessman who'd suggested they discuss a private arrangement in the club's exclusive setting. Weinstein had apparently believed that an exception could be made for someone as important as Bumpy Johnson. He was wrong. Thomas Murphy, the doorman, saw only what the system had trained him to see: a well-dressed black man trying to enter a whites-only establishment. Murphy's response was automatic, reflexive, backed by 12 years of absolute authority to turn away any colored person regardless of their status or accomplishments. "Get back to Harlem where you belong," Murphy had said, not realizing that Bumpy Johnson already owned more of Harlem than any white man ever would. Behind Bumpy, the line of white patrons watched with expressions ranging from amusement to mild discomfort. They were waiting to see whether this uppity colored man would make trouble or accept his dismissal quietly, the way colored people were supposed to. The strategic mind at work. Most men in Bumpy's position would have responded with immediate violence. The 1935 version of Bumpy Johnson was already legendary for his razor work, already feared throughout New York's underworld. He could have carved Murphy's throat open right there on the sidewalk and walked away, while the white patron screamed. But Bumpy Johnson possessed something far more dangerous than a quick temper: strategic intelligence. As he stood there feeling the eyes of the white patrons on his back, listening to their murmured comments about knowing their place, Bumpy understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't personal. Murphy probably didn't even know who he was. This was systemic. The Cotton Club represented everything wrong with how white America profited from black culture while maintaining absolute segregation. And arguing with Murphy would accomplish nothing except providing entertainment for white patrons who would later tell their friends about the colored man who'd been properly dealt with by the authorities. So Bumpy did something that required more self-control than most men possessed. He smiled, the kind of cold, measured expression that suggested he was memorizing this moment, held Murphy's gaze for 3 seconds, nodded once, and walked away. But he wasn't retreating. He was planning. The walk that changed history. For 15 minutes, Bumpy walked through Harlem's evening streets without any particular destination, letting his anger settle enough that he could think strategically rather than emotionally. He found himself standing outside the Savoy Ballroom on Lenox Avenue, watching black patrons, working people, professionals, families entering an establishment that welcomed them, that was owned and operated by black businessmen, that provided entertainment without humiliation. Standing there watching people enter the Savoy, Bumpy had a realization that would change not just his own thinking, but eventually the economic structure of Harlem's entertainment industry. The Cotton Club was physically located in Harlem. It employed Harlem musicians and staff. It generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually from white people who came to Harlem specifically to visit the Cotton Club. But despite being in Harlem and depending entirely on black talent and labor, it was owned by white businessmen, operated according to white rules, and excluded the black community from participating as patrons. The arrangement extracted wealth from Harlem while giving almost nothing back except minimum wages and the privilege of serving white people who came to be entertained by black culture while maintaining strict segregation. But what if that arrangement could be challenged? The phone calls that started a revolution at the corner of Lenox Avenue and 141st Street. Bumpy found a pay phone and made 3 calls that would set everything in motion. First, Theodore "Teddy" Green, his attorney and closest advisor, a brilliant legal mind who understood both the criminal world and legitimate business. Second, Stephanie Sclair, the numbers queen who controlled substantial gambling operations throughout Harlem and who'd been Bumpy's mentor before he built his own organization. Third, Adam Clayton Powelster, minister of Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most influential legitimate leaders who'd been fighting discrimination for decades, but had never had the raw power necessary to force white establishments to actually change. By midnight Thursday, Bumpy had assembled 15 people in the back room of a speakeasy on 133rd Street, his own top associates, representatives from other black policy operators, union officials who controlled colored workers in service industries, ministers from major Harlem churches, and several black professionals, doctors and lawyers who'd experienced their own humiliations at white establishments. This wasn't just a criminal gathering. This was something unprecedented, a coalition that combined criminal resources with legitimate community power, organized around a single goal that went far beyond personal revenge. The strategy session. Bumpy stood at the head of the table and spoke in his characteristic quiet voice that made people lean forward to hear him. "The Cotton Club turned me away tonight because I'm colored," he said, his voice carrying that controlled intensity that people who knew him recognized as more dangerous than shouting. "The doorman called me boy and told me to get back to Harlem where I belong." He paused, watching faces around the table change from curiosity to anger to something that looked like hunger. The irony is that the Cotton Club is in Harlem. It's on West 142nd Street, right in the middle of our neighborhood. It employs our musicians, our waiters, our cooks, our cleaning staff. It makes its money from being located in Harlem and featuring black entertainment. But it won't let black people sit in the audience. Several people around the table nodded, recognizing their own experiences in what Bumpy described. "It takes everything from us, our talent, our labor, our neighborhood's reputation, and gives us nothing back except minimum wages, and the privilege of serving white people who come to Harlem to be entertained by our culture, while making sure we understand we're not good enough to share their tables." The vulnerability analysis. Bumpy's voice dropped even lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear him. But here's what the Cotton Club's owners don't understand. They're vulnerable in ways they haven't considered. He began pacing behind the table, his intensity building. The Cotton Club depends on black labor. Every musician, every waiter, every cook, every person who makes that establishment function is colored. The Cotton Club depends on being located in Harlem. Its entire appeal to white downtown patrons is that it offers an exotic experience of coming to a black neighborhood to see black entertainment. And the Cotton Club depends on Harlem tolerating its presence, depends on us not making trouble, not organizing resistance, not using the power we actually have. The room was silent, everyone understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented. "We're going to teach the Cotton Club's owners that extracting wealth from Harlem while insulting Harlem's people carries a cost. We're not going to burn the place down. That would just give them insurance money and sympathy. We're not going to attack their white patrons. That would give police justification to crack down on all of us. Bumpy stopped pacing and faced the group. Instead, we're going to make operating the Cotton Club so difficult, so expensive, and so problematic that the owners conclude they have two choices. Either they open the Cotton Club to black patrons and end their discriminatory policies, or they sell the establishment to black owners who will operate it as an integrated venue. The multi-front campaign. What followed was 2 hours of detailed planning as Bumpy and the others developed a comprehensive strategy that combined methods ranging from completely legitimate organizing to subtle intimidation. Labor organization. Every black employee of the Cotton Club would be contacted and organized. Musicians would demand higher wages and better working conditions, threatening to strike if demands weren't met. Waiters and kitchen staff would slow down service subtly, making operations less efficient without doing anything obvious enough to justify firing. The goal was to increase labor costs and reduce service quality enough that white patrons began complaining and operating profits declined. Supply disruptions. The Cotton Club depended on various suppliers for food, liquor, linens, and essentials. Through Bumpy's connections and Claire's network, these suppliers would be given a choice to stop doing business with the Cotton Club or face problems with their other Harlem customers. Since most suppliers did substantial business throughout Harlem, losing access to Harlem's broader market was more costly than losing the Cotton Club's business alone. Community pressure. Harlem's churches and community organizations would begin public campaigns criticizing the Cotton Club's discriminatory policies. Sermons would address the club's racism explicitly. Community meetings would organize boycotts of any businesses that supported the Cotton Club. The goal was to create enough public controversy that the club's policies became indefensible and embarrassing. Regulatory complications. Through connections with corrupt police and politicians, minor legal and regulatory problems would be created. Health inspections would suddenly find violations requiring expensive fixes. Fire safety reviews would identify concerns needing addressing. Liquor license renewals would be delayed. None of these problems would shut down the Cotton Club immediately, but collectively they would cost money and attention. Economic competition. Bumpy and Claire would invest in establishing alternative entertainment venues that welcomed black patrons, venues that could compete with the Cotton Club by offering similar quality entertainment in integrated settings. If black musicians could earn comparable money performing at integrated venues, the Cotton Club would struggle to maintain the talent it depended on. The campaign begins on Monday, September 23, 1935. The campaign began with a bombshell that sent shock waves through the Cotton Club's management. Duke Ellington, the club's biggest draw, the musician who'd made his reputation there and remained their most valuable performer, announced to management that he was demanding a 50% increase in his band's compensation, plus improved working conditions, including better dressing rooms, meal provisions, and respect from management. When management refused, pointing out that Ellington had a contract that didn't expire for 6 months, Ellington responded that contracts could be broken and that he'd received multiple offers from other venues willing to pay substantially more than the Cotton Club. The threat was credible because Bumpy and Claire had indeed contacted Ellington with offers to perform at alternative venues, and Ellington, who'd experienced his own humiliations from Cotton Club management over the years, was willing to leverage those offers to extract better terms or leave entirely. Simultaneously, problems began appearing throughout the Cotton Club's operations. Death by 1,000 cuts. Kitchen staff started working more slowly, claiming they were being extra careful about food preparation, but actually coordinating to reduce the number of meals they could prepare per hour. Wait times for white patrons, who weren't accustomed to waiting, began stretching from minutes to nearly an hour. Waiters began making small mistakes, delivering wrong orders, forgetting drinks, taking longer than necessary to bring checks. Not enough to justify firing anyone, but enough to create frustration among patrons who expected perfect service. Suppliers began experiencing mysterious problems. Trucks broke down at crucial moments. Orders were misfilled repeatedly. Deliveries that should have arrived Monday wouldn't show up until Wednesday, forcing the Cotton Club to scramble for alternatives and pay premium prices for rush deliveries. Meanwhile, various regulatory agencies suddenly developed intense interest in the Cotton Club's operations. The health department wanted improvements to the kitchen. The fire department insisted on additional exits. The liquor license authority began asking detailed questions about whether the club's ownership structure complied with various regulations. The pressure mounts by the second week. Cotton Club management was drowning in problems they couldn't quite identify the source of, but that were clearly costing money and affecting the customer experience. Duke Ellington was threatening to leave, which would devastate the club's ability to attract white patrons who came specifically to see him perform. Labor costs were increasing as they gave raises to key employees to prevent them from quitting. Supply costs were soaring as they paid premiums for reliable deliveries, and regulatory problems were requiring expensive fixes and creating uncertainty about whether they could continue operating legally. Owney Madden, the Cotton Club's owner, understood that someone was organizing this pressure, that these problems weren't coincidental. Madden had connections to white organized crime, had political influence, had resources that should have allowed him to identify and crush whoever was causing trouble. But when Madden reached out to his contacts asking for help, he kept hearing the same name, Bumpy Johnson. The impossible position. When Madden tried to use his mob connections to pressure Johnson into stopping whatever he was doing, Madden discovered something that shocked him. None of the white gangsters he knew were willing to intervene in a conflict between Madden and Johnson over what was essentially a racial issue in Harlem. Harlem was Johnson's territory in ways that went far beyond simple criminal influence. Johnson had built relationships with legitimate community leaders, had earned respect from working people, had created a network of loyalty that made him more powerful in Harlem than any outside figure could be. The white gangsters understood what Madden was slow to realize: fighting Johnson in Harlem would cost more than the Cotton Club was worth. Johnson had resources and community support that made him effectively unbeatable on his home ground. After 3 weeks of mounting problems and mounting costs, Madden received a message asking him to meet with Theodore Green. Madden agreed, assuming this was an attempt to negotiate some kind of settlement. The negotiation on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October 1935. Madden sat in Green's office listening to an explanation of exactly what was happening and exactly what would be required to make it stop. "Mr. Madden," Green said, speaking with careful legal precision, "the operational difficulties you've been experiencing at the Cotton Club are the result of organized response to your establishment's policy of refusing to admit Negro patrons. This policy is offensive to Harlem's community, particularly given that your establishment is located in Harlem and depends entirely on black musicians and staff, and is no longer acceptable to the people who make your business possible." Green pulled out a prepared document, a proposed announcement that Madden would issue stating the Cotton Club would no longer refuse service based on race. "The difficulties will continue and will intensify until you announce that the Cotton Club will open its doors to Negro patrons, that colored customers will be welcomed and served with the same courtesy provided to white customers, and that you'll take concrete steps to demonstrate this change is genuine." Madden's face flushed with anger. "You're telling me that coloreds are sabotaging my business? That Bumpy Johnson is behind this? I can have that nigger killed tomorrow. I've got connections throughout this city. You think some Harlem policy operator can threaten me?" Green's expression didn't change. "Mr. Madden, you're welcome to attempt retaliation against Mr. Johnson if you believe that's wise, but I should inform you that Mr. Johnson has anticipated that possibility and has taken precautions. If anything happens to Mr. Johnson, the campaign against your establishment will intensify rather than stopping, because Ms. Johnson has organized a coalition of people who will continue this pressure regardless of what happens to him personally." Green leaned forward slightly. "And more importantly, Mr. Madden, you should consider whether the Cotton Club is worth dying over. Because if you attempt violence against Mr. Johnson will respond with violence against you, and you'll discover that you have less protection in Harlem than you believe you have." The calculation, the threat was clear and backed by reality that Madden understood once his anger cooled enough for strategic thinking. He could probably have Johnson killed if he committed sufficient resources to it, but doing so would trigger gang warfare that would cost more than the Cotton Club was worth, would bring law enforcement attention he wanted to avoid, and would solve nothing because the coalition Johnson had organized would continue pressuring the Cotton Club even after Johnson was dead. Madden was facing the same calculation that had defeated Dutch Schultz earlier that year when Schultz had tried to maintain control of Harlem against Johnson's resistance. Fighting Johnson in Harlem cost more than any possible benefit from winning. "What exactly are you demanding?" Madden finally asked, his voice controlled again, recognizing this was a negotiation rather than a situation he could solve through violence. The announcement wouldn't require Madden to actively recruit black patrons or make dramatic changes to how the club operated. Just required him to publicly commit that colored customers who attempted to enter would be admitted and served rather than being turned away at the door. The announcement would be publicized through Harlem's newspapers and churches, would be verified by having prominent black community members attempt to enter the club and be admitted, and would end the campaign against the Cotton Club if Madden maintained the policy genuinely. The surrender Madden spent another hour negotiating specific language and commitments, trying to preserve as much of the Cotton Club's existing character as possible while accepting the fundamental requirement that racial discrimination at the door had to end. Finally, on October 15, 1935, exactly 26 days after Bumpy Johnson had been turned away, Owney Madden issued a public statement. The Cotton Club announces that it will welcome patrons regardless of race. The club's historical policy of admitting only white customers is being changed effective immediately. Colored customers who wish to attend performances will be admitted and served with courtesy and professionalism. The announcement was met with skepticism from many in Harlem's community, who assumed this was merely a public relations gesture that wouldn't translate into actual change. The test to verify the policy was genuine. Theodore Green organized a test on the evening of October 18, 1935. A group of well-dressed black professionals arrived at the Cotton Club and attempted to enter. The doorman admitted them without incident. They were seated, served with the same professionalism as white patrons, and enjoyed Duke Ellington's performance from the audience rather than being excluded, while their culture was performed for white entertainment. The integration of the Cotton Club sent shock waves through Harlem and beyond. The ripple effect: if the Cotton Club could be forced to integrate through economic pressure, the model could be applied elsewhere. Over the following months, Johnson's coalition applied similar pressure to other discriminatory venues, gradually forcing integration throughout Harlem's entertainment industry. The success proved that economic power, when organized systematically, could force changes that moral appeals couldn't produce. The methods Johnson pioneered would be studied and replicated by civil rights activists for decades. The historical precedent what Johnson accomplished influenced civil rights organizing for 3 decades. The Montgomery bus boycott used many of the same organizational principles. The sit-in movements and targeted boycotts of the 1960s followed organizational models Johnson had pioneered. The combination of labor organizing, supply disruptions, community mobilization, and economic pressure became a template that changed American history. The legacy, "You don't belong here, boy," were the words that started it all. Johnson's response, walking away quietly, organizing comprehensively, applying pressure systematically, proved that belonging isn't something white doormen grant, but something people claim for themselves through intelligence and determination. 26 days from rejection to victory, from segregation to integration, from humiliation to triumph. That's how you break segregation forever. Not with violence, but with strategy, organization, and the understanding that real power comes from what you can build, not what you can destroy. The Cotton Club had rejected Bumpy Johnson. His 26-day response broke the model that had allowed segregation to flourish throughout American entertainment. And it all started with a doorman who thought he had the power to tell the king of Harlem where he belonged. He was wrong. If this story of strategic brilliance moved you, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to understand how real change happens, through intelligence, organization, and patience. Drop a comment. What can we learn from Bumpy Johnson's approach to fighting injustice? How do we organize for change today? Remember, the Cotton Club integrated because one man refused to accept that rejection was permanent. In 26 days, he changed American history through strategy over rage. The economic blueprint, what made Bumpy Johnson's campaign against the Cotton Club revolutionary, wasn't just its success. It was its sophisticated understanding of economic pressure points that wouldn't be formally theorized by civil rights scholars until decades later. Johnson understood that segregated establishments like the Cotton Club operated on a business model that depended on black labor and black culture while excluding black economic participation. This created vulnerabilities that could be exploited systematically. Labor dependency. Every segregated establishment in Harlem faced the same fundamental contradiction. They needed black workers to function, but refused to serve black customers. Johnson recognized that this dependency could be weaponized through coordinated labor action that stopped just short of outright strikes, creating maximum disruption with minimum legal risk. Supply chain vulnerabilities. The Cotton Club's reliance on Harlem-based suppliers created another pressure point. By organizing suppliers to choose between the Cotton Club's business and access to Harlem's broader market, Johnson created a cost-benefit analysis that made supporting segregation economically irrational. Regulatory leverage. Johnson's understanding of how corruption worked in 1935 New York allowed him to use the system's own contradictions against it. The same corrupt officials who normally protected white-owned businesses could be induced to create problems for those businesses when the political calculus changed. Community solidarity. Perhaps most importantly, Johnson understood that economic campaigns required sustained community participation. The Cotton Club campaign succeeded because it united criminal organizations, legitimate businesses, religious institutions, and working families around a shared goal. The Cultural Revolution. The integration of the Cotton Club represented more than a change in admission policies. It was a fundamental shift in how black culture was consumed and valued in American society. Before October 1935, the Cotton Club model had been replicated throughout American entertainment: white ownership, white audiences, black performers, and absolute segregation. Black artists were exotic entertainment, not cultural equals deserving respect. The Cotton Club's integration forced a recognition that black cultural creators had the right to be present as audience members for their own culture. When Duke Ellington performed at the newly integrated Cotton Club, he wasn't just entertaining white patrons. He was performing for a community that included people who looked like him, understood his references, and appreciated his artistry on its own terms rather than as exotic spectacle. This shift would influence how black artists approached their craft for generations. The knowledge that black audiences could be present in previously whites-only spaces changed the dynamic of performance itself, allowing for cultural expressions that didn't need to be filtered through white expectations or sanitized for white consumption. The political implications. Johnson's success at the Cotton Club demonstrated something that mainstream civil rights organizations of the 1930s had struggled to prove: that economic pressure could force changes that moral appeals and legal challenges couldn't achieve. The NAP had been fighting discrimination through courts and legislation for decades with limited success. Legal victories were often undermined by local resistance or inadequate enforcement. Moral appeals fell on deaf ears among white business owners who profited from segregation. But Johnson's economic campaign produced immediate, measurable results. 26 days from rejection to surrender. The Cotton Club's integration wasn't a symbolic victory. It was a concrete change that any black patron could verify by simply walking through the front door. This demonstration of economic organizing's effectiveness would influence a generation of civil rights activists who recognized that hitting business owners in their profits was more effective than appealing to their consciences. The long game. What Bumpy Johnson accomplished in 1935 was essentially a pilot program for strategies that would become central to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The Montgomery bus boycott, launched 20 years later, used many of the same organizational principles: coordinating community resources across class lines, maintaining discipline among participants while applying sustained economic pressure, and refusing to accept partial measures that didn't address fundamental discrimination. The Nashville sit-ins of 1960 combined economic pressure with moral witness in ways that directly echoed Johnson's approach. Students occupied lunch counters while community members boycotted segregated businesses, creating economic costs that made discrimination unsustainable. The Birmingham campaign of 1963 targeted the city's business district with coordinated boycotts and demonstrations, applying the kind of comprehensive economic pressure that Johnson had pioneered at the Cotton Club. Each of these campaigns succeeded because they understood what Johnson had figured out in 1935, that segregation was maintained not by law or tradition alone, but by economic arrangements that made discrimination profitable. Change those economic arrangements, and the whole system would shift. The man behind the movement, the Cotton Club campaign, revealed aspects of Bumpy Johnson's character that complicated simple narratives about crime and community leadership. Johnson was undoubtedly a criminal who used violence and intimidation to maintain his gambling operations and protect his territory. But he was also a strategic thinker who understood that some battles were worth fighting for reasons beyond personal profit. The doorman's insult at the Cotton Club could have been answered with immediate violence. and nobody would have been surprised if Johnson had carved Thomas Murphy's throat open right there on West 142nd Street. Instead, Johnson chose a response that required more self-control and more intelligently systematic organizing that produced lasting change rather than momentary satisfaction. This choice revealed something important about how power operates in marginalized communities. Sometimes the most effective leaders are those who understand both legitimate and illegitimate forms of power, who can move between criminal networks and community institutions, who have the resources and connections to challenge systems that seem unbeatable to those working within legal constraints alone. Johnson's criminal activities provided him with resources and connections that legitimate civil rights leaders of the 1930s simply didn't have. His willingness to use illegal methods gave him leverage that moral appeals couldn't match, but his strategic intelligence and community focus ensured that his criminal resources were deployed for broader social goals rather than mere personal enrichment. The irony of history, perhaps the greatest irony of the Cotton Club integration, is that it was accomplished by a man whose methods were illegal, but whose goals were entirely moral, ending racial discrimination and opening opportunities for black participation in American society. Meanwhile, the legal system that was supposed to protect civil rights was actively enforcing segregation. Police arrested black citizens for attempting to enter whites-only establishments. Courts upheld discriminatory laws. Government officials at every level maintained systems of exclusion that denied basic dignity to black Americans. Johnson's illegal campaign to integrate the Cotton Club was more aligned with American ideals of equality and opportunity than the legal system of segregation that it challenged. The criminal became the defender of constitutional principles while legitimate authorities enforced unconstitutional discrimination. This irony would be repeated throughout the civil rights movement, as activists breaking unjust laws were arrested by officers enforcing those same unjust laws, as sit-in participants were jailed for claiming rights that were supposedly guaranteed by the Constitution, as freedom riders were attacked for challenging segregation that violated the fundamental American principle that all citizens deserve equal treatment. The enduring legacy today, the Cotton Club building no longer exists, replaced by modern development. But the methods Bumpy Johnson used to integrate it live on in countless social movements and community resistance efforts. Every time workers organize for better conditions, they're using strategies Johnson pioneered. Every time communities boycott businesses that don't serve their interests, they're following his playbook. Every time marginalized groups use economic leverage to force changes that political appeals couldn't produce, they're building on foundations he laid in 1935. The Cotton Club campaign proved that change doesn't always come from moral persuasion. Sometimes it comes from making the status quo too expensive to maintain. Sometimes justice is achieved not by appealing to conscience, but by making discrimination unprofitable. That was the insult that changed Harlem. That was the quiet walkaway that broke segregation's most powerful symbol. That was how one man's humiliation became an entire community's victory. Bumpy Johnson walked away from the Cotton Club's door on September 19, 1935, and walked into legend. Not because of what he destroyed, but because of what he built. A movement, a method, a proof that intelligence and organization could accomplish what violence and rage never could. 26 days. That's how long it takes to break segregation forever, if you know how to fight the right war. If this story of strategic brilliance and systematic change moved you, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to understand how real change happens. Not through anger, but through intelligence, organization, and the patience to play the long game. Drop a comment. What can we learn from Bumpy Johnson's approach to fighting injustice? How do we organize for change in our own time? Remember, the Cotton Club integrated because one man refused to accept that rejection was permanent. He walked away from violence and walked toward victory. And in 26 days, he changed American history. That's the power of choosing strategy over rage. That's how you break segregation forever.